What's up guys, it's Z here, welcome back. Today, let's take a look at the meta because with the release of the new Banlist as well as the release of Dimension Force, so many changes have happened to the game and I feel like Konami did once again a really great job at addressing issues of the format. Of course, we knew that decks like Despia, which were the most dominant deck before, were not going to get touched because of how new they were, so the best thing we could hope for is for cards like Anaconda to be banned, Aurora Dawn, and Meow Moo for things that we were just bored of seeing, that we've been seeing for such a long time to get addressed, and Konami delivered, and now we are presenting to you the 10 most represented decks that you're going to see in the following format moving forward. So if you enjoy the video, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our upcoming content, and now let's get to the list. Number 10, DDD. Now DDD is a deck that now, regardless of which region you're playing in, whether you're playing it in America or in Europe, you have all the tools needed. With the release of King Rage in Ghost from the Past Second Haunting, the deck is at full power, and even though this deck doesn't have the highest ceiling possible out of any combo deck, the thing about this deck is that it's a deck that people like playing because of how challenging it is to learn all the curves that you need to go, all the plays that you need to learn depending on which deck you're playing against, which hand you're dealt with. It's a really fun deck to play. While not the strongest deck, people still are going to keep playing this just because of how good the deck can feel and how rewarding it is when you get those combos right. So I'm putting it at number 10, even though it is not the strongest deck, but it's a deck that I feel like people just enjoy playing, so you're going to see some of it for the following format. Number 9, Plunder Patrol. Now, the adventure package stayed intact. We were considering maybe that Konami would feel like putting the Aramesir and Water Enchanters to 2. They didn't even do that. They just felt like it was okay to keep it just like that for the following format, and this is why decks like Plunder Patrol, which are using this adventure package like nothing else, can just thrive for the following format, because decks like Prank Kids got completely butchered. It's not going to see play whatsoever. You would have to play like the old school Prank Kid deck where you would have to draw 2 Prank Kids with a fusion card. That's not practical at all. But a deck like Plunder Patrol, which again can do so much with only a few cards, and the advantage can snowball out of control. It's a deck that you would see and feel like it's very slow during the early game, but it feels like a control deck, which it doesn't have the most explosive turn 1s, but the advantage just steamrolls your opponent as long as it gets to play. So this is why this deck, I feel like it's a really good contender for the upcoming format, mainly because of the adventure package, and this is why I put it on the 9 slot on this list. Now let's get into something very interesting. At number 8 we have Salamangreat, and this deck, oh boy, this deck, this is probably the biggest winner out of this ban list. Not only do we have 3 copies of Circle now, so the deck is super consistent, we have multiple copies of Stalio, so even though it's at 3, we're going to play 2, we're not going to play 3, but the second copy of Stalio means that we don't have to consider putting it back with Jaguar during the early game, and we're going to have this pressure during the late game, because not only is a good card to facilitate monsters from the deck, but having this bounce is really important to be able to break boards in a deck that doesn't do it as consistently as other decks, so having multiple copies of Stalio helps with that. On top of that, Pot of Desires is at 2, and even though we would love it to be at 3 for a deck like this, it's much better than being at 1. Konami realized that putting Desires at 1 was completely random. Pot of Prosperity is a card that sees plays in better decks, and it's a much better card than Pot of Desires, but in a deck like Salamangreat, which Desires is by far the best pot you can play, this deck just got back so many tools. All the deck is missing now is multiple copies of Gazelle, which yes would be really great, but I feel like still with what we got right now we can't be complaining just because of how good this deck is. It's a budget deck if you exclude access code, which is still, if you just need access code for a deck like this, it's not like it's super expensive, and you can expect so many people giving it a try again just because of how good the deck used to be and of how well the deck can adapt to a lot of formats, just because that it doesn't need to play too many engine cards and has the room to play a lot of hand traps, so it can adapt depending to beat the best deck of each format. So yeah, you can expect to see this deck a lot, especially in the first weeks of the following form. Number 7, Tri-Brigade, another winner of the ban list. We got 2 copies of Tenki, so this deck became more consistent and it did get a back seat. And the thing about this deck is that the branded Tri-Brigade version is kind of dead, because it was the only branded version that required heavily on Anaconda, because the deck did link summon a lot, so it was not like it could hard activate brand fusion, so without Anaconda it doesn't work. But pure Tri-Brigade does have a lot of ways to deal with the format, just because it's another deck that feels very similar to Zodiac. It does quite a lot by not committing too much on the board. It can go more combo heavy, but the thing is you can play so many hand traps similar to Salamangreat to deal with the current meta, so Tri-Brigade is a deck that can be stopped quite easily, but if it doesn't, then it can do quite a lot and keep having resources for the entirety of the game, with cards like Revolt keep giving you disruptions on top of searches. It's an amazing deck, and you can expect to see it a lot in the next form. Number 6, Invoke Shadow. Now, again, Invoke Invoked is a deck that you can expect to see for the entirety of the metagame until they get hit, which they might never. So with Shadows being a really good thing for the format, being able to counter Branded by just using more powerful fusion spells than them, because Shadow Fusion, when you're going second, is arguably just as powerful as Branded Fusion, so Shadows do have ways to counter the deck. And the thing is, this deck can also incorporate Branded Engine, can incorporate so many other stuff, it can incorporate the Dogmatica package, because it's a deck that doesn't require any kind of leniency. It just gives you anything you need for any type of situation, and all these engines require just a few cards, so you can put all of them together and put hand traps as well in it. So it's basically the new base deck of the format. It can put so many different engines in one particular deck, so your opponent doesn't really know what's gonna come next when they try to deal with the first engine. So this is why I feel like the unpredictability of this deck makes it so hard to deal with, and I think it's the best going second deck that you can play in the format, just because of how much value you get with cards like Shadow Fusion going second. Yes, of course, the deck can go first and try to lock your opponent with Winda, but I feel like the going second power that you get out of cards like Branded Fusion, Shadow Fusion, and of course the deck being able to main deck Super Poly like no other, because you have the Shadows, so it's not like you completely rely on your opponent for the Super Poly fusions. So yeah, I feel like going second with this deck is probably the way to go for the upcoming format. It can deal with pretty much any board, it has the tools to deal with monsters, with back rows. It's an amazing deck, and this is why it's well deserved for the number 6 slot on this list. Now, moving on to the top 5, let's start with a new deck. At number 5, we have Therions. So Therions, we don't really know yet exactly which build is going to be the most relevant one. The ones that we are kind of considering to be the best ones, first off, is the Therion ABC that can also use the adventure packets, because ABCs don't use any effects when they're normal summoned, you just link them away and they get effects in the graveyard. So Therion Adventure ABC is going to be a really good deck, but also we can expect pure Therions with more of a plant engine to do a splash, mainly because that this is one of the few decks that, aside from Heroes of course, that will still be able to use Fusion Destiny, because the deck will play Predaplant or Free Scorpio with Darling Tonyan Cobra and Lonefire Blossom, because you need to put plants in the grave to make Borea a starter for Therion stuff. So when you can play a plant engine that starts not only the Therion packets but can also search Fusion Destiny, then yes, of course, it's going to be much stronger, because the decks that can still use Destroyer Phoenix Enforcer are going to have such an edge compared to other decks that were relying solely on Anaconda in order to get to that, because if you want to play Fusion Destiny in any other deck now, you have a 50-50 chance of either drawing a good card or a brick, and you're going to see them 1 in every 4 games because they're both at 2, Fusion Destiny and the bricks. So it's not the most consistent thing to consider for a really good deck. So Therion being able to use Fusion Destiny still and having all those other engines that it can use, we can expect that this deck is going to do a splash. It's a really good deck. The monsters are very free that you can do with them so much. They have interruptions, they have search power, and yes, you can expect to see a lot of Therions as a deck or even as engines in other decks as well. Number 4, Eldritch. Now Eldritch, again, pretty much the Eldritch doesn't get hit in every in any ban list, and ever since Skill Drain went to 3, Eldritch became more of a deck than 4, because it was supposed to be the anti-meta part of the format, but still Eldritch, even as a pure Eldritch now, because of course the Eldritch package that was being played in this Cyber's version of a deck that was using Cyber's gadget to scythe-like your opponent, without DP and Anaconda, that's not possible anymore. But here we're talking about pure Eldritch, and pure Eldritch can win games just with floodgates, and that's enough to win games sometimes, because if your opponent is not prepared, this deck is the king of game 1. It's going to steal most game 1s, especially going first, because it can incorporate any floodgate. For example, Rivalry of Warlords is a really good card to play in Eldritch right now, because Despia is so popular, so you can pretty much counter them with that. Skill Drain at 3 is a card that you're going to see in every single Eldritch deck just because of how powerful Skill Drain is. It does lose a little bit to the adventure packets, but still, Eldritch has other traps in order to back it up. So yeah, I feel like this deck is not going anywhere. People are picking it up just because of how simple it is to play, and it's very, very beginner friendly, which any player that starts the game right now, they're possibly picking up this deck more than any other, just because of how simple it is and how many games it can win with just activating floodgates on your opponent. Now, for the top 3 decks, these 3 decks I feel like are the absolute best decks of the format. You can argue for any other deck that you can play in the other 7 spots. There are so many other decks that can do so well in the format, but these top 3 are the absolute most relevant ones that you're going to see the most moving forward. And number 3, we have Luanderies, another deck that did not lose anything in the ban list. It was very clear that Konami was going to aim more towards the generic engines, and they were not going to hit any specific archetypes. And yes, Prank Kids, while it's actually an archetype, it mostly felt like an engine in a 60-card deck that had other engines as well, so I'd hardly use the word as an archetype for the Prank Kid the way it had become. But Luanderies is one of those archetypes that can play on its own without relying on any supplementary engine, and and because of how many good cards this deck can play, cards like D-Shifter or cards like Harpy's Featherstorm, it can deal with a lot of cards. And Floowandereeze having floodgate cards like Barrier Statue, negations like Apex Avian, removal with the Ryza. It has so many good cards that can do, and depending on the hand Floowandereeze player gets dealt with beginning of the duel, it might be very easy to deal with it with hand traps, or it might be impossible to deal with it with hand traps, because cards like D-Shifter shut down a lot of hand traps. With when you have the adventure, you can basically deal with cards like Imperm as well. This deck, sometimes it just feels unfair to play against, because if it gets rolling, it's very impossible to deal with it. It gets back all of its resources every single time, and this is why Floowandereeze, I feel like it's a superior Eldritch deck. It's basically the control of the top 3, that you can just do so much more that you can do with Eldritch, and it's much more difficult to either side against it or just hand trap it because of how many ways it has to play around hand traps as well. Number 2, Tenny Sword Soul. Now, Sword Soul was seeing much more play before even the ban list was released, and because some people just picked it up again and felt like it was a really good mid-range deck that you can use. And with now, it has only lost Needle Fiber with the Aurarodon combo, and some people were not even playing that, to be honest. Even just playing Tenny Sword Soul with just the mid-ranged part of the deck being able to mass advantage by using so few resources and basically get really big boss monsters on the field that can use interruptions. This is what Sword Soul does best, and I feel like this is enough to do well in a format like this, because even though Branded is a very, very powerful deck, I don't feel like it's a deck that is very difficult to understand when you're playing against it and what you need to do to beat it, because that was the problem with the pile decks. I mean, it's similar to what I mentioned with Invoke Shadow, is that it had so many things to do that you didn't really know which one to counter or what you would have to counter next when you countered one thing. And this is what the format now is going to lack. The format is very straightforward. We know exactly what each deck does best, and this is why Tenny Sword Soul is a deck that does have its own tools of being able to control the board with the amount of cards, like using one card with Moye to get a big monster on the field and another search, one card with Longyang to get a Baron and another search. So you basically can incorporate any other type of generic card that you need in the deck in order to make it work. The Tennies give the deck the extenders it need, because it was very reliant on its normal summon if you were not playing the Tenny package, because sometimes one disruption on Moye might have been enough to beat you, but now with the Tenny package, sometimes you can get a Chiza on the field without even committing to a normal summon. So this is why the Tennies work so well with the deck, and I feel like giving it the second slot on the list is very, very justifiable. You can argue between 2 and 3 of which one is going to be better, Floowander or Sword Soul, but I feel like these two decks are basically the decks that you're going to see the most if you exclude the first deck. And for the number 1 spot, I don't feel like anyone is going to be surprised. We have Branded Despia. Now, regardless of which build you're playing, if you're playing pure or if you're playing with the adventure package, both of these builds are the ones that we're going to see the most in the upcoming format. The deck did not lose anything. Even if you're playing the adventure package, you didn't lose a single copy of Aramezir or Water Enchantress, and this is why Branded Despia, with all of its tools that it has, it's such a good deck. And with the release of Dimension Force, Despia actually became stronger, because now it also has a trap card that can be considered kind of a super poly card as well as a revival card. So a searchable one-off that can do so much gives such a huge boost to the deck, and yes, this is going to be the best deck. You need to be prepared for it. You need to side deck or even main deck cards that are designed to play against this deck to counter cards like Branded in Red and Branded Fusion, because if you're not prepared for a deck like this, then you're going to get bodied 100% of the time just because of how powerful it is, and this is why this is going to be the best deck until we get to the Splite format, but this is for another video. We're going to cover that in the future. So yep, that's the video, guys. Comment down below if you feel like any other deck is worthy of being in this top 10 list. The lower numbers, mainly 10 and 9, can be replaced with so many different decks just because of how many good decks exist right now, and because of the absence of the pile decks, I feel like a lot of other decks also have a chance of competing if they just prepare to beat Branded and all those top decks. So I feel like we're going to have a really great format, and we're going to enjoy it until splites are released. So yep, that's the video, guys. If you enjoyed it, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our upcoming content, and we'll see you next time.